Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human.
Robert Pippin, welcome to our podcast, The Journey of an Aesthete.
Thank you.
I'm really delighted to have you on the show for a couple of reasons. First reason is that I've been reading your work, I think, since as far back as modernism as a philosophical problem.
That does date you a bit.
Well, I'm 54, so no. But I've been trying to get you on the show because I really think that your scholarship, research, your work in its entirety really relates to one of my themes on the podcast. Because after all, we talk about what it means to be human, and I guess way of introducing you, you're one of the foremost, if I may say so, scholars of Hegel, Kant and Hegel. Mm-hmm. And you also have many books on the arts, and this is most unusual. The only other person I can think of who's written as much and as fluently and diversely about the arts was maybe Stanley Cavell, but you've written on Westerns, you've written on Film Noir, you have a recent book on Douglas Sirk, you've even written on so many wonderful filmmakers, and I really like your book on Henry James a lot. Henry James
Thank you.
and Modern Moral Life. And your most recent book, which I finished for this episode, is Philosophy by Other Means. Arts and philosophy in the arts. So there's a lot there in your career and your writing to tackle. So if we can begin, maybe I sometimes like to do a kind of a linear chronology, which is a fancy way of saying personal biography. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, you're at University of Chicago now, I'm wondering how you came to be the kind of thinker and writer you are, what brought you to Kant and Hegel, or what brought you to writing about classic Hollywood movies, or Henry James, or whatever comes to your mind that you want to talk about in terms of your story with that.
Let's see. I went to college at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and I was an English major there, and very, very involved with modernist literature, James, Proust, Faulkner, Eliot. But in my junior year, I started taking philosophy courses, and I became much more interested in the kind of approach to basic philosophical problems in the German tradition, starting with Kant and going all the way up through Heidegger and beyond. So at the very last minute, I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy, and there weren't many graduate schools in the United States where one could study the German tradition in philosophy, but Penn State was one of them. It was a very unusual department, sort of a marginal department at the time in the American Academy anyway, although well known in Europe. And then, when you go to graduate school and you write a dissertation, I wrote mine on Kant. It wasn't as if I'd lost the interest I had in the arts, but, professionally, when you identify yourself with a subfield with a dissertation, you get hired in that subfield, and then you're expected to teach courses in that subfield. So, it wasn't anything I found onerous. I loved writing about the German tradition. Mm-hmm. But professionally, it wouldn't have been fair to my department if I'd started teaching courses in film or history of painting or literature in general. I would have been sort of shirking my responsibilities. But in 1991, I got an invitation to join the Committee on Social Thought here at the University of Chicago, and that was sort of permission to join what for me was academic heaven. I had no sort of subfield responsibilities. I also joined the philosophy department, but my position is in the Committee on Social Thought, so that's the unit to whom I owe my first responsibility. And it wasn't long before I realized I should take advantage of this, and I began working on a kind of philosophical book about Henry James. And so that was the beginning. I mean, it was really the permission to do whatever I wanted to do when I was lucky enough to come to the Committee on Social Thought. And then
we hold that thought because I wanted to ask you a brief question because that committee is somewhat famous. Isn't that committee connected to the same department that had at one time Saul Bellow and Hannah Arendt, or is that a different?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, right. Bellow was a colleague of mine when I first arrived. I got to know him a little bit.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And then we've also had poets like Mark Strand and novelists like the Nobel Prize winner John Coatzee as colleagues in the committee. Mm-hmm. And now we have very good poet Rosanna Warren in the Committee on Social Thought. So we've always had literary figures, anthropologists, classical scholars, German and French literature experts, philosophers, psychoanalysts, theologians. Yeah. So it really is a kind of ideal interdisciplinary environment. And all of us who are primarily appointed by the committee have responsibilities only to the committee, which is to teach whatever we like. Mm. Film interest was always a very, very serious interest of mine. First in European films, so-called art cinema in Europe. But I got, thanks to a colleague of mine who got me interested in them, I got really interested in American Hollywood film in the way that the French did, that these were really serious works. They weren't just commercial vehicles. So I was offered an opportunity to do a series of lectures at Yale called the Castle Lectures on some aspect of political thought. And because I had been used at the committee to doing whatever I wanted, I asked them if they would mind if I gave a series of lectures on Hollywood Westerns. I think they were a little
Is that when you first working on the essay on Liberty Valance?
Yeah.
Okay, because I want to talk a little bit about that film if you don't mind later on. We don't have to now, but
sure.
I wanted to ask you questions about it. But so that's interesting. And so, what do they say to that when you?
Well, they said, you're going to have dinner with the guy who endows the lecture series, and it's, we've had Habermas and Rawls, and I said, well, yeah, if you don't mind, I don't mind.
Yeah.
So I gave the lecture series, and then I had another invitation from Virginia to do the same thing, and I asked them if I could do film noir and problems of agency in film noir, and they didn't mind either. And so then I got really interested in writing about film. Cavell was a great inspiration for me, as well as the Cahiers du Cinéma, the French critics in the 50s and 60s. So it was these two events, being able to come to the committee, having had a background in literature from college, and then being asked to give these lectures and having people who invited me nice enough to let me do what I wanted, that gave me the opportunity to pursue these interests that I wouldn't have been able to pursue had I been sort of locked into a traditional subfield in an academic department.
So there's a sense in which the trajectory of your career, teaching, thinking, writing, is connected to Hegelian themes, right?
Yes,
I suspect.
Yeah, both Hegelian and also, there's Nietzsche's use of Greek tragedy and the birth of tragedy, Heidegger's use of Hölderlin and Rilke. Those philosophers are always the ones that interested me, and I was always interested in their refusing to consider literature a marginal or merely sort of decorative form of philosophy. And was able to work on that in that tradition philosophically, and then when I came here, was able to do something of what they did with the arts.
Do you mind me asking you a more up-to-date question because it concerns your latest book? If you wanted to discuss to a layperson, say, an outsider or someone that isn't that well versed in Hegel or some of these topics, to try to capture the strong responses to tragedy as an art, because your first essay concerns tragedy and how Kant and other people responded very, shook up their world. What is it about tragedy as a form that had this effect or does have this effect? If that's too broad a question, you can...
No, I think it's quite an interesting question because one of the reasons one thinks of literature and the arts and film as possibly having a bearing on philosophy is that philosophy, however kind of capacious its scope is, a lot of philosophers think they know everything about everything. However capacious, philosophy also has its own limitations. In the sort of traditional sense of the logical analysis of concepts, or the logical analysis of language, however one wants to put it, there are things that fall outside that human beings want to think about. seriously and deeply and reflectively, but don't fit this sort of pattern of philosophy that's evolved since Socrates, kind of necessary, sufficient conditions for. But there are a lot of concepts like jealousy or revenge or resentment or despair or tragedy that philosophy has. What tragedy really suggests is that there are fundamental human conflicts that lead to a kind of suffering that doesn't make any overall sense. And for philosophy, that doesn't make sense. There isn't anything that doesn't make some sort of sense. So the idea that we confront in our lives failures that seem to us in some way fated and without any kind of normative redemption. I don't mean things like plane crashes or something. I mean things we do to ourselves.
Right.
And those we're very close to that are outside the realm of what philosophy can help us with, as philosophy has traditionally been understood. So I think what philosophers first try to do is domesticate tragedy. Like, for example, Hegel is a perfect example of this. Hegel really argued, perhaps more eloquently than anybody, that philosophy is impoverished if it doesn't rely on another way of presenting the issues that matter to philosophy in a form that has a kind of affective and sensible meaningfulness rather than conceptual meaningfulness. But when it came to tragedy, like the tragedy of Antigone or the conflict between Creon and Antigone that's unresolvable, Hegel wants to treat that as temporary, that is to say, as provisional, that once the Greek experience of the political had been transcended and finally into the modern world, that the tragic sensibility was no longer relevant. But that's a typical example of a philosopher, as I say, trying to domesticate tragedy, to make what it confronts us with, the very painful things it confronts us with that we can't avoid, more acceptable, more sort of rationally integrable into an ordered form of life. And it isn't integrable. So philosophers, I think, tragedy is one of the examples where philosopher needs another way of understanding meaningfulness in human life that isn't a function of following a norm or a moral law or a kind of ethical ideal. There are aspects of human life that those things aren't relevant to, and we need these imaginative geniuses to help us understand them.
That's interesting. So you're saying that the work that someone like Henry James does in fictions is actually there's a I don't say utility. There's almost a necessity in terms of human self-understanding, right, or consciousness.
Exactly.
Exactly. I want you to mention something about Hegel and freedom, because there's I think it's it's in Practical Philosophy, which is I think one of the best books on Hegel, if I may say so. And I think it, you make a point that Hegel, I think it's in Phenomenology of Spirit, doesn't have a negative definition of freedom. He's very exacting about what freedom is, right? So it isn't a matter of the freedom to say no to some inner desire or some action. Do you mind talking a little bit about his special notion of freedom, or his?
No, I don't at all. I mean, he's often misunderstood. He's Berlin, in other words, described to him a kind of positive notion of freedom in which some agency like the state knows what it is to live a free life, even if you don't. It's like, the People's Democratic Republic of East Germany or something. Right. Democratic, not by virtue of people voting, but by what they would vote for, were they non-alienated in a way, that kind of thing. But and he also accused him.
I should tell the audience, you're talking about Isaiah Berlin's misunderstanding of that tradition, or Hegel. Yes. Is that connected to at that time, the gap between Anglo-American analytic philosophy?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. This had to do really with the destruction of the reputation of Hegel, both in Anglophone philosophy in the first half of the 20th century, because of the revolution that analytic philosophy wanted to bring to Russell and Moore and Wittgenstein and so forth.
Yeah.
But also after the war, a lot of scholars, intellectual historians, political theorists, were trying to figure out what could have possibly gone wrong in Germany, one of the most advanced, literate, scientifically capable, politically stable up till the 1920s countries in Europe. And this tradition of thinkers like Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Heidegger, that became a kind of target. And Hegel was accused of not valuing sufficiently the individual human rights, that he wanted to sort of suck all that up into some sort of organic whole and treat individuals as merely properties of some ethical substance.
Right.
So they didn't count as having the moral weight they did in the liberal democratic tradition. But what Hegel was essentially trying to say is just having the capacity to do what you want to do unimpeded by the will of others, in a way that gives them a like capacity to do what they want to do, as long as they don't interfere with what you want to do, is much too limited a conception of freedom, because how people's wants, their interests, and their desires, how they're formed, that's really a very short-sighted view of it. So at the end of a long process of socialization, education, acculturation, and so forth. So that if we're what freedom really means is being able to identify, that is to say, affirm, see yourself in the life you're living. I mean, in other words, you can freely go to the factory, so it's chicken processing plant or something. Nobody forces you to. You could quit. But you don't see that life as a human life, as anything you would recognize as the life you want to live. Now, of course, there's a great deal of necessity in human life. You can't, we are finite beings who have to accept a lot of things we would normally not want to accept. But it does seem a rather limited conception of freedom just to think of it as non-interference. Right, of course. Consistent with the non-interference of everyone else in a like manner. There has to be a way of understanding a life that isn't, in the classical sense, alienated, even though it's freely chosen in the sense that nobody holds a gun to your head.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating to me how Hegel's been beaten up for so many things, and it seems to me twisted to the opposite of what he meant in many instances. I think you would agree with that, right? He gets blamed. He gets blamed for all sorts of things. I don't even think I could list them all here, but you're saying, well, freedom itself is abused, right? Of course, it's captured by, as you know.
Yeah.
I guess right now, freedom is used by the political right wing, right? I think it seems to me now, but I don't know.
Very much. We live in the age of so-called neoliberalism, which is the kind of absolutization of this notion of non-interference. People should be maximally left alone to do whatever they want, as if what they want and how they live is uninfluenced by very powerful forces that have a stake in them developing a certain kind of interest useful for those who profit off it. So, it's a very short-sighted notion, but we now live, I think, in an age of globalization in the triumph of neoliberalism and the triumph of this very narrow and, I think, ideologically suspect, since it serves the interests of some very powerful interests, for us to think this way. But that's what freedom consists in, simply being maximally left alone. And even if being left alone means other people are going to get sick.
Wow.
Because we're spreading germs that we shouldn't be spreading. Well, that's just too bad. That's the price of freedom. But that's crazy. That's like saying you have the right to drive drunk.
Yeah, so you're saying that you're saying that Hegel's philosophy is practical.
Yeah.
Very practical.
Yeah, I
that
think
formulation you just said about, being drunk on the road is something we don't want. There's a kind of practicality to that, I have to, after all, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be concerned with what Hegel called ethical life. The relationship within a society of the family, education, the workplace, small organizations, cultural units. You can't. All of that contributes to what it is to live a free life. to see your life as your own, rather than what's just required of you to make money.
Is that connected
a lot of people,
to, is that, hold on thought, is that connected to when Hegel's notion of recognition?
Exactly.
Genuine recognition, right? Is it?
Yeah. I mean, the great ideal of this post-Hegelian political tradition is that no one is completely free unless everyone is free, because the lack of the free status of others means that their acknowledgement of you or their relationship to you in general is not what it ought to be, given that they're not able to really be free responders, partners in the adventure of life, right? However you want to put it. We need other people for a kind of moral balance in our lives, a way of assuring ourselves that we're on the right path, that we're not deceiving ourselves and so forth. But we can't have that if we are recognized by people whom we don't recognize as equals, because we think of them as in the grip of unfree forces. So you only, according to Hegel, can really establish yourself as the being you want to be if you're also taken to be that being by others. Otherwise, you're living a kind of fantasy life. And if you don't find yourself reflected in your own view of yourself in the way people treat you, then it becomes a very frustrating and dead-end kind of way of living. But they can't be your recognizers unless they're free to do so.
That's certainly true. It makes me think of your work on Portrait of a Lady. If you don't mind talking about individual works, because you, of course, gave a lecture on Portrait of a Lady. And, I mean, there's a lot of, James, we could discuss What Mazing Knew, which you write about in your newest book. And But I, for some reason, I'm thinking of Isabel Archer and Osmond and those characters. And what comes to your mind when you think about that novel and what it's one of the many things it's saying in connection with what we're discussing now?
One thing that does come to mind is this topic we've just been talking about. Isabel, her ideal is to be a free woman. She has all this money. And she thinks being free is making sure she doesn't do what everyone expects her to do. So marrying Osmond, whom everybody basically can see is kind of a creep, self-interested, manipulative. This all turns out to be true, as she finds out to her horror 2/3 of the way through the novel. But she marries him because she thinks it's bold, it's free. I mean, she has this image of herself of just charging into the night in a carriage with horses, and a kind of authenticity, a notion of freedom, that she's her own person and she's not going to do what everybody else wants them to do. But she finds out that she had no idea what she was doing, who Osmond was, what world she was entering. There's a wonderful exchange between her and Madame Merle.
The famous exchange, which I take to be actually a metaphor for the oldest debate in the arts between form and artifice and authenticity, right? Is that kind of one way to...
Yeah, well, she tells Madame Merle, when Madame Merle is telling her something about how she should dress and what her clothes are, she says, I don't care anything about my clothes or my house or anything like that. I just, I'm very much the young authenticity person. And Madame Merle says, no, I believe just the opposite. I believe you're expressed in every gesture you make in the social world that gathers to it recognition from others as who you want to be thought of. Right. And Elizabeth said, well, I don't care anything about that. And she I don't care about my clothes. And Madame Merle says, should you want to go without them? There's no way, in other words, to avoid kind of social struggle for status and recognition.
I'm wondering how classmates respond to if you teach this novel, what the different responses you've gotten to Portrait of a Lady, or what speaks to about it.
It's interesting. It's sort of the same kind of problem in teaching Madame Bovary. The students think she's really kind of stupid in marrying Osmond, and then they're really, really bothered when she goes back to him in the end. That's, I think, the main reaction of contemporary students. We're much more used to the idea of divorce and separation and so forth. And they can't understand. It is a great question. They can't understand why, having found out what a rat he is, she goes back. And she says she goes back to him because, it's sort of, I've made my bed, I'm going to lie in it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do this. She tries to regain her integrity by refusing to dismiss her past. She takes it on board. But contemporary students find that as difficult as they find having sympathy for poor Emma Bovary.
Mm-hmm.
They think she's just foolish for spending all her money.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a response that isn't entirely uncharacteristic of how James himself partly feels, right? I mean, it's certainly...
Yeah, it's a mystery why she goes back, but he wants to. He doesn't want to explain everything. He respects the fact, I think, even though I probably wouldn't agree with the decision, that she's going to try to live out what she agreed to, rather than just try to cut and run.
Right. It's amazing. You've written on filmmakers, and I wouldn't even know. I mean, going back, I want to get to Terrence Malick because I really want to discuss a little bit him because I think he's really, really special. But I wanted to go back to some of these Westerns. So from what I remember of your Hollywood Westerns book, you seem to be taking that these John Ford, that these directors were actually talking about, deep political issues.
Yeah.
In guise of sort of traditional classical narratives. Talk about some of those deep issues. I know that Liberty Valance is about myth and what kind of statehood. I mean, certainly.
Well, when I started writing that book, I was actually working on issues in Rousseau about the whole question of political psychology. Most liberal political theory for the last 150, 200 years or so has been concerned with the problem of the legitimacy of state power. So, a group of people has the monopoly on the forces of violence, and they get to tell other people what to do. What distinguishes a group of people who exercise control over others from a legitimate exercise of power by the state, and that has something to do usually with consent or implied consent. But we know that in political life, people are willing to subscribe to demonstrate allegiance to a regime, not really at all on the basis of having been convinced of some argument in Locke or Kant or Hobbes or Hume. We need to try to figure out what the actual positive psychological forces are that contribute to a stable political regime. And Westerns are essentially, the great ones, about that. They're about the transition from a state of lawlessness and independent self-reliance, which is a great American ideal, to a bourgeois market culture, banks, railroads, schools, school teachers, churches, and so forth. And the question is, what goes on psychologically to make such a transition seem acceptable to people? And very often the answer is not very much. They resent it. The transition is painful, and it leaves a residue of dissatisfaction and regret that you can see at the end of Liberty Valance. Where it would take a long time to summarize the whole plot, but a woman who has, having had a choice between this kind of pre-bourgeois, noble honor culture man, John Wayne, and the representative of the order of law, Jimmy Stewart, she's chosen Jimmy Stewart. And at the end of her life, we can see in a little train ride that she's taking with her husband, that she regrets it. You can see in her face, it's a wonderful moment in Ford. It's as if all the pain that Freud would call the necessary repression necessary for civil life is in her face. It's almost as if the foundation of social order is a tragedy in itself. It's necessary, but in some way other than necessary, negative, painful. Thing we would want to avoid. So it seemed to me that there was no way in philosophy or sociology to have very good access to the dynamics of sort of the inner dynamics of the soul in this question of political submission to an order other than your own, except by these kind of imaginative explorations by Ford, Hawks, Anthony Mann, Bud Bedecker, Sam Fuller, people like that.
Yeah, if I'm thinking about Ford, is just visually, it is connected to painting too, wouldn't you say?
Oh God, yeah. Well, yeah. The idea of, there are two things that his Monument Valley scenery does. One is, especially the way he photographs it, to convince us of how small we are, how puny we are within the forces of nature, and the other is to create a kind of notion of sublimity. That the forces of nature have a kind of beauty and power that we're part of. That we should be close to appreciate.
That's right. That's most clear in his cinematography.
Absolutely.
Visually, it's. I'm wondering, going from westerns to film noir might be at first blush a great change, a different kind of environment, different topic, subject, emotions. But,
well, I actually considered those books a kind of bookends because. Film noir is about what happens psychologically when, or just within the internal lives of people, when the forces of order begin to break down. Westerns being about what happens when they begin to be set up. Mm-hmm. And noirs are really about, in the post-war era, about a suspicion that the forces of order are corrupt. In most bars, the police are either incompetent or corrupt. The city is run by bosses that are in the employ of criminals or otherwise disreputable characters. You can't really count on or trust the legal order anymore. And then the question is, what does life look like when you have to plan and execute, actions?
It looks like Pickup on South Street, right? Or
oh yeah, yeah. Well, Pickup on South Street is a kind of Sam Fuller anti-communist movie, and kind of in an obvious sense. But it's first of all, it's unbelievably beautifully photographed. Oh, yeah. It was the inspiration for Robert Bresson's Pickpocket.
That's right.
Just because how beautiful the cinematography is. But that theme of this kind of desolation and potential despair can be redeemed by love, which is one of the themes in the film. Richard Widmark finally. Yes. It's funny you mentioned Pickup on South Street. I've just been thinking about it because I'm working on Bresson. So I actually just saw it.
You're writing a book on Bresson.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be the first person to get that.
You're a fan of Bresson?
I'm more than a fan. I'm a fanatic.
Yeah, me too. It's impossible to be anything else.
I've probably seen Balthazar maybe 10 times.
I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, well, Bresson, isn't that a guy who made a movie about a donkey? And I said, yeah, that's one of the best films ever made. If you don't cry at the end of that film, there's something wrong with you.
And Mouchette.
Oh God, that's as painful as Rossellini's Open City or something. That's a terribly painful movie.
Do you mind talking about Bresson a little bit? Because one of my favorite of his films is Four Nights of a Dreamer.
Uh-huh.
I know that
I haven't seen in a long time. I'm working my way up to that.
It's a movie that's sort of lost, right? It's Bresson's lost film. It's kind of
yeah. Last weekend, I just saw The Trial of Joan of Arc, and I was blown away by that. I thought a movie that short that just uses the transcripts from the rehabilitation trial would be boring, but not in the hands of Bresson. It's absolutely gripping.
Yep, that's right.
And it raises this question that Country Priest raises, which is what's the difference between a serious and deep commitment and a nearly insane obsession?
That's right.
Which are very delicate lines sometimes, both in Country Priest and in Joan of Arc. And that's one of the things I'm interested in. He's exploring the modern reliance on conscience.
Oh, interesting.
We tend to believe that the final touchstone for a moral life is our inner sense of right and wrong. And Bresson believes that too, but he believes it can get out of control with a kind of narcissism.
Can you talk a little bit more about his worry? Because that's an interesting idea to clarify it. go a little deep, because at first it's not quite. You're saying it's a. Is he concerned about artificial rules taking the place of an instinct?
No, just in a way, just the opposite. He's concerned about the reliance on something like an inner voice as the ultimate authority.
Interesting.
In what we ought to do. I mean, this is especially true of religious commitment. I mean, Bresson is in some ways a religious filmmaker, but that issue touches so many other issues. Mm-hmm. You don't have to actually be a believer to appreciate his movies. But he is, I think, worried about how being so subject, like we are, to self-deception and self-aggrandizement and self-inflation and self-protectedness, how we ever manage to be convinced that what we feel to be, here I stand, I can do no other, kind of ultimate line in the sand morally, is trustworthy. Because it's sometimes right on the verge of being a kind of self-indulgent narcissism, as if you are the king of the moral world. And when we lose a kind of humility about our convictions, it doesn't necessarily mean that we become, obsessive narcissists. Joan of Arc has a lot of integrity in that movie. She's really quite admirable, quite beautiful as well, and her resistance to what is even worse than the danger she represents, which is this corrupt order of the Anglophile priests at the Sorbonne who tried her. Anyway, this is a very specific topic for your listeners who might not have seen the movie, but it's this general theme.
On our podcast, we go into the weeds on things because it is an arts podcast, and I try for it to be unique among podcasts, both in how we go into things and also the diversity of topics covered. I want to stay on Bresson a little bit more. Are there other films that demonstrate this danger, where it's clearly either in the narrative or in the characters who are led astray, like a false voice or something?
I mean, take the issue of grace, which is one of the dominant themes in his movie. Maybe my favorite movie by him is sort of Bresson before he became Bresson, Les Dames de Bois de Boulogne, the ladies of the. Yeah,
it's a great movie.
So here's the question about that movie. At the end, when the woman is sort of dying of shame after she's been exposed at the wedding by the evil manipulator who runs the whole show of deception, there's a transformation, a moment in which, because her new husband reaffirms his love for her, she's transformed. She doesn't die, and there looks like a moment of grace. That nothing we could have predicted, that the husband comes around. When everything we've seen of him so far is a kind of superficial, banal, lazy, thoughtless guy. All of a sudden, he's not. So, what Bresson very often investigates is what is this all of a sudden phenomenon, where a life turns around? I mean, it's most obvious in instances of conversion, but those happen in secular life all the time.
Yeah, they do.
Where the same thing at the end of Pickpocket, for example.
That's right.
Where he sort of comes out of himself.
That's right.
So same thing in A Man Condemned to Man Escaped, where the guy has to make a sudden decision whether to trust this boy who has both uniforms on. It could be a German spy, it could be a French resistance fighter, and in order for him to try to escape, he has to make this sudden decision to trust him, the way people do in ordinary life when they form romantic relationships. They have to trust something in them that allows them to believe the other person is trusted. What is that? Is what Bresson is asking. And how could it be separated from so many other near pathologies in our psychology?
That's right. Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Well, I'm wondering, too, which brings me to Malick, because there must be some connection there. And I know I'm tempted to ask you about Malick you haven't written about, because he's made some films in the past year. A Hidden Life, of course, and Night of Cops, and some more recent. I'm curious your response to some of his more recent work.
Well, I'm a big fan of Hidden Life. And the thing that connects him to Bresson and other filmmakers that Bresson inspired, like the Dardenne brothers, who are another favorite of filmmakers of mine, is this concept of so-called slow cinema that the director Paul Schrader wrote about in his book on transcendental style in cinema. Bresson, Ozu, Carl Dreyer, long takes.
That's right.
Unhurried photography. That's right. That will linger for a long time on things like empty doorways or stairwells or fields of blowing wheat. Or Malick is the same way. Yeah. I mean, he's making films that have to make money, but he's like the Dardenne brothers, uncompromising about the style of the movie. And that style fits into this general notion of, slow cinema that asks for.
I definitely think so. Although I think he has his own totally unique Malick personal touch. Yes. That's, and so talk more, because Hidden Life is a recent release and many of our listeners may have seen it. What are the themes that film is grappling with? There's many what comes to mind?
Well, again, it's interesting because it's connected to Bresson in a thematic way as well. So you have a man who's a conscientious objector and who's about to ruin essentially his whole life, his children, his wife. How does he know he's right? I mean, the thing about describing these as questions that the film raises is that implies that the films have something like an answer, and the only kind of answer we get is 2.5 hours of living with this man.
That's right.
There's nothing you can really point to as, well, he has this principle and he has a good argument for it. And talking about limitations of philosophy again, I mean, a philosopher would just ask, well, is he justified in believing that conscientious objection is the way to go here? Well, he's not doing it because he's convinced of an argument. So why does he think?
So you're saying there's an absolute consistency between the style of the film and the way it proceeds philosophically. That is, it's in that sense opposed to propositional thinking.
And the other thing is it's just the same thing as Tree of Life. These are also very many sections of the movie are projections of the protagonist's point of view.
Okay,
like the scenes where the main character in Hidden Life plays with his children, and it's extraordinarily idyllic, beautiful scene, laughing children, laughing wife. Clearly that's not a realist depiction of his Sunday afternoon. There's a way that Malick often, and it's very particularly true in Tree of Life, projects the point of view of a character as it's really like what in literature they call free indirect discourse.
That's right.
Where you think you're reading a third-person narration, but you're actually reading it from the point of view of the character. Yeah,
it is Malick person. Malick does that. That connects to Henry James, of course, right? And some of the
absolutely.
I know that you've written on Proust. I mean, I can't get out of this episode. You've written twice that I know of on Proust. An early book in.
I have 3 pieces on Proust. One on becoming who one is, one on the problem of jealousy, one on the problem of subjectivity in Proust.
I mean, it's a big topic, Proust.
What that's the top of the mountain. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he certainly. Would you say he's one of the best writers on the subject of jealousy, or at least among the most?
No one even remotely close.
Okay.
The shadow of love. Why does Proust, or the narrator, because also complications on who's speaking in the relation to Proust, but why does the narrator believe that love is inseparable from jealousy? And why is everybody in the novel so consumed by jealousy? One way of answering that would be they're just peculiarly insecure psychological characters that have no general significance at all. We're just reading the story of some effete, lazy, wealthy French people in the first part of the 20th century, whose lives are so shallow and insecure, and they're such narcissists that they're obsessed with the idea that their beloved is not being faithful to them. That's a pretty stupid way to read a novel with the ambition of Proust. He's actually trying to tell us something about the dynamics of human love and what's potentially dangerous about the dynamics of love. The role of fantasy. That's right. The difficulty in presenting yourself to the other as you are rather than as you want to be seen. The inevitable anxiety about whether you're acknowledged in the way you think you want to be acknowledged by the other. Source of jealousy right there. Why betrayal by another, or even attentiveness by another to someone else, can provoke this anxiety in you, how difficult it is to know that another loves you. I mean, those things are pursued by Proust, again, not in a thematic or, as you said before, a propositional way, but by virtue of thousands of pages in which we become ever more familiar with, without even really being able to propositionally lay out everything we've come to know. Right. We become experientially familiar with a character that is credible, and we learn something from that credibility about the human condition in general.
Well, I'm wondering too. There's a bit of a Hegel Renaissance going on now. You've just delivered a paper on Hegel today. I think it was on YouTube. A recent conference.
Yeah, there is. The situation is very different than when I started out in the early 1970s.
That change. That's interesting. Yeah.
Writing on Hegel then was like writing on Madame Blavatsky or something. It was just considered, not worthy of serious philosophical interest. But then a number of things began to change. The level of German scholarship in the post-war period changed. It became much more philosophical. There's a long story involved there, but that was my main formative interest, was the people in the Heidelberg School in the 1960s. But then Charles Taylor published an important book when he was an Oxford Don, for the time he was at Oxford.
That book.
And he had a high reputation in analytic philosophy because of his book on action, on human behavior. And he treated Hegel quite sympathetically as a political and social philosopher. So that part of his program was kind of during the era of communitarianism, when there were critiques of liberalism and the limitations of liberalism starting to be made. Hegel fit right into that. And then I published Hegel's Idealism in 1989, which tried to rehabilitate the theoretical dimensions of Hegel's project as much more intelligent than a kind of theological metaphysics, and that caught on. That inspired a lot of critical reaction, but a lot of discussion, and then very, very important people in Anglophone philosophy like John McDowell and Robert Brandom began writing on Hegel, and that made it. I mean, he's still a marginal figure in Anglophone philosophy, but it's now possible for people to write dissertations on Hegel without being suspected of some sort of occult insanity.
Well, Hegel himself was a very. If you were faced with a room full of people who had never read a word of Hegel, and you know that Hegel is really valuable, revolutionized philosophy in the West, and you wanted to impart that through Hegel's art, what text would you suggest they start with? In other words, if they had to start with a book, or what would you?
Well, the difficulty, I tell my students, the difficulty with Hegel is there's no shallow end of the pool.
Okay.
Wherever you go, it's deep. But I would suggest they start with the introduction to the lectures on aesthetics.
Ah, okay.
Those are among the most readable lectures in Hegel, and they're actually quite exciting. Mm-hmm. In that Hegel is sort of responsible for shifting the task of criticism from one based on evaluation and taste to a philosophy of art, mm-hmm. informing criticism. Also responsible for the way we teach the art in our colleges and universities, because we teach it historically. And that was due to Hegel, that we should view artworks in their historical period in connection with their previous and successive moments. But you also get a sense of how important for Hegel history, which he introduced into philosophy, that philosophy, for the first time with Hegel, had a kind of diagnostic role. What does it mean that we live the way we live, and are we living the way we ought to be living? What can philosophy tell us about that? Not just whether we're subscribing to the right philosophical norm, but what does it mean to live this way? How do we find it meaningful to live in market-oriented consumer culture with a sort of flailing democracy at this point? What sense can we make out of that? That diagnostic role for philosophy, it helps in a way understand meaningfulness in an age, past and present, is something Hegel introduced into philosophy that I think is quite crucial.
Mm-hmm. Well, applying those questions to Douglas Sirk. Now, Douglas Sirk was making films in the 50s.
Yeah.
And of course, he's associated with, stylistic things that are considered unique to that era. The color and the acting. But I suspect this is the one book of yours I have not read, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask you, what does Douglas Sirk say? Or what do those questions apply? What does Douglas Sirk say about not just the 50s, but about 2021?
Yeah, well, Sirk in the 1950s made, with Universal Pictures, melodramas. And melodramas are, in a way, the kind of bourgeois society version of tragedy. We have melodrama, not classical tragedies. That is to say, they're domestic, they're either family romances, relationships between parents and children, or they're romantic melodramas in which the emotional lives of people caught up in romantic relationships that are very important to them come a cropper. They have all kinds of difficulties and tragedies, just disasters in that sense. And Sirk was particularly interested in the kind of quiet suffering that underlies a great deal of daily life in even upper middle class bourgeois societies. Melodramas deal with the intersection of, especially Sirk's, these two fundamental human needs: the desire to love and be loved, and the desire for some status, some standing, some measure of respect from others. And a lot of his films help us to see why the way we live now, where those two things are very important, often necessarily conflict. That the ambition necessary to achieve a certain kind of status often involves compromises, self-deceit, sort of cutting corners in a way that makes a kind of integrity and authenticity in romantic relationships, which inevitably get perverted by the power of money and influence and status, very difficult, very painful. So on the one hand, it's focused on, the emergence of a consumer society in the 1950s, but that society hasn't gone away. And if anything, the sort of problems of, what one calls spiritual meaning in a consumer society are just as critical today. We're sort of surrounded by death of despair, opioid addiction, alcohol addiction, dissatisfied marriages, single, a lot of new arrangements for the having and raising of children that might not be ideal, let's say. So I think the Sirk is basically considered somebody who made so-called women's pictures.
Yeah.
But Sirk himself was probably the most educated Hollywood director ever in Max Ophuls. Sirk was studied with Panofsky. He was one of in the 30s. He was the leading avant-garde theater director in Germany and in Europe. He was the main director of Bertolt Brecht. Tremendously well-read, well-educated, and became fascinated by the American middle class.
That's right.
He said once in an interview that he was fascinated by it because it's out of that milieu that Hitler arose in Germany, and he hadn't expected it there, and he wondered whether the situation was ultimately going to be similar here.
He was a few decades early, right? I mean, that's kind of
yeah, but he wasn't wrong, was he?
He wasn't wrong, unfortunately. I mean, you feel it. I don't know.
And this is really tied to this issue of how we get at kind of collectively felt human psychology, especially notions like resentment and disappointment and bitterness about one's life that are fueling so much of the rage and anger we see. How do we understand that?
I mean, understand them not just merely as physiological things in the brain, which too often some scientists want to reduce them to, right? But also historically and also right in a more, you might say, comprehensive manner, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, these experiences people have are so complex that some way of understanding just what it's like for them to experience them, in what context, in what relation to other people, out of what origins, given what socioeconomic class, what it's like to experience a world in which you find yourself excluded, without a place, homeless in effect. I mean, you could say it like that, and it sounds like you're talking about a snapshot, but even a 2-hour film or an 800-page novel, you're just scratching the surface. But at least you're scratching the surface.
Well, that's better than not tackling it at all, right? And not even
exactly. And it's so unappreciated. I mean, by most people, these Hollywood films are considered just commercial vehicles designed to entertain people. But these people were serious. These directors.
Well, Douglas Sirk is pretty serious. I mean, if you look at Written on the Wind or All That Heaven Allows, I mean those are
Yeah, well, I hope you enjoy the book when you see it. I mean, I don't know if you're a Sirk fan or not, but I hope it turns you around.
I am a Sirk.
Oh, good.
So not reading your book is not due to my lack of interest in Sirk.
Good.
It's due to the 24/7, 24 hours in the day type of thing, and read one thing. And,
of course. I
mean, I'm most excited about your Bresson book. When is that slated to?
Oh, I don't know. I'm going to take my time with this one, so probably another 2 years.
Oh, excellent.
I'm going to teach him in the spring.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. Then I'm going to spend all of next year just mulling it over. I'm also interested in the idea of...
I'm impressed upon you that the underrated, I want you to rehabilitate 4 Nights of a Dreamer. That's such a film.
It's good you mentioned that. That's one I've seen in a long time, and I'll go back and watch it now. I like the later film. I like L'Argent the best, Money. But I think my favorite film is Les Dames de Bois-de-Boulogne. That is just that's a much more typical cinema, not cinematography, as he put it.
Right.
That really is a movie. And he after that and The Angels of Sin, he decided he didn't want to make movies anymore. He wanted to do cinematographs. And then he made Diary of a Country Priest and Man Escaped and Pickpocket, and they became very, very different films. The one I can't really get into.
Damn, I mean, you could almost drop somebody in it and ask them who directed it, and some people would. You could almost think it could be George Stevens or George Cukor for
those first films. Yeah, those first films. I'm really interested in the reaction of the students because it's slow cinema, and after Spielberg sort of ruined the movie's attention span acceptance, I'm wondering if they're going to put up with it.
Yeah.
He'll shoot a guy walking up a set of stairs and just hold the camera on the stairs for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. I don't know if students are going to put up with that. I hope so. I taught melodrama 3 years ago, and I taught,
Did you ever teach Now Voyager?
Pardon?
Did you ever teach Now Voyager?
Yes, that was one of the films, yeah.
Okay.
I taught Caught, Reckless Moment, Now Voyager, Stella Dallas, Rebel Without a Cause, what else? And then Sirk, All That Heaven Allows, and Written on the Wind, and Imitation of Life.
And what was the mood of the class, or what were the essays like, or what were the...
Really good. I mean, at one of the showings, at Imitation of Life, at one of the showings, there were 2 students in the front row that were just weeping so uncontrollably. I had to stay and make sure they were all right.
Wow.
I took that as just a great confirmation that I should be showing students these movies. Same thing when I taught Hitchcock.
Interesting.
The first reaction is, you're putting all that in the movie. That's not there. These are just entertaining thrillers, and I consider it one of my jobs to disabuse them of that notion. Look, these are serious objects worthy of intense, repeated viewing.
I just rewatched Shadow of a Doubt by Thornton Wilder and Hitchcock the other day.
That was Hitchcock's personal favorite.
And my favorite of his films, actually.
Yeah, well, there's nothing can touch Vertigo as far as I'm concerned.
Right, of course, but I'm just saying, other than Vertigo, Shadow of a Doubt. Do you ever teach that particular film? Or?
Yeah.
Oh.
I have a chapter on it in a collection of mine called Film Thought.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm very, very fond of that film. I mean, the uncanny closeness of Charlie and Charles is, I think, the most interesting thing in the movie.
I'm curious how students responded to Joseph Cotton. First of all, as a performance, a piece of acting, but also as a person and the character is just really...
Yeah. The funny thing is that Hitchcock, he's really an odious, he's a serial killer. He's willing to kill his niece.
Right.
But don't you think the film creates a kind of, if not sympathy for him, but at least some sort of understanding? I mean, the reference to the accident when he was a child, and then the need his sister has for him. It's not, sort of Simon Legree kind of villain. There's a psychological depth to the character, especially given how much Charlie, the niece, admires him, is close to him.
Oh, yeah.
Hitchcock's raising the question, and her basic attitude is, this town is dull, boring, this bourgeois life I'm living is. It's really the same attitude he has. And she's sort of confronted.
This is the Thornton Wilder part of the script of the film. Because Wilder is always trying to rehabilitate or make us re-examine things that are considered dull or conformist, and try to see if it's what our town is all about, right after all, in part.
Right.
But,
Thornton Wilder quit as screenwriter because he could see that what Hitchcock was doing was actually saying, the town is crap. But it doesn't mean you should be a serial killer.
Right.
The ending of it, the deep irony of the ending where the FBI agent is saying, we just go a little crazy sometimes, but it's all basically good. And that just rings with such irony at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
These people are completely incapable of dealing with a character like the Joseph Cotton character. They're naive, weak, unexperienced. Thornton Wilder is wrong. These forms.
He's certainly wrong about in that instance. Yeah, I'd have to agree with that.
Lives of quiet desperation.
I still love Wilder. I think he's underrated, and I think. I think that
he's a great talent.
I think that in that sense, Shadow of a Doubt is a movie way ahead of its time, right? And so there's something about there's something about that film that seems the violence of it and the frightening aspect to it is
Well, the conversation they have in the bar when, if you tear down the facade, you see these grunting animals. The picture he gives Charlie of what is behind the facade of civility in bourgeois life is is about as ugly a speech as there is in all of film.
That's right. So we're going to have to wait till 2024 for your Bresson book.
I think so. Yeah. I have a couple of other things I'm working on too, but
what
I'm really, really excited about it.
But what else are you working on in addition to Bresson? There's a couple of other things. Are they on painting or?
Well, I'm just finishing a book on Heidegger's critique of the German idealism tradition, called The Culmination. Heidegger thinks most of Western philosophy culminated. That means came to a completion after which there is nothing worth doing more with Hegel. And I worked all my life on this tradition, on Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel.
Sure.
And I decided before I quit writing, I should take account of why Heidegger thinks this tradition misses what's essential in philosophy, and its culmination is the end of at least metaphysical philosophy. So I got a fellowship to take a year off in 2019-20, and then of course we all went remote.
Yep.
So we were living on in our farmhouse in upstate New York, and so we stayed there. So I was able to work on this for 2 years straight every day, except for the days I had to be Zooming during the teaching. So I got a lot of work done.
I bet you did. Well, that paper, that brand new paper came out of that. I got to hear you read it and Hegel Today, Hegel Today conference. So that's part of that same on Heidegger.
Yeah.
Well, what are your impressions of some of the more radical? I don't know if that's fair, but there's many contemporary philosophers who are deeply influenced by Hegel, but aren't immediately identified as such.
Yeah.
I guess Judith Butler comes to mind for some reason. I don't know.
Sure. Her first book was on Hegel.
Have you done seminars with Judith Butler or have had any?
No. I read her stuff. I think I reviewed her first Hegel book for the Phil Review. Reviewed it very positively. Okay. I like that book. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, you can put it, if I were speaking to just an exclusively American audience, I would put it in terms of American pragmatism. What Hegel began to convince philosophers of was that various so-called philosophical questions, what is the mind-body problem, the existence of universals, the existence of God, is there a moral law? These questions don't just sort of float around in a Platonic, rarefied, abstract heaven. Yeah. They always arise out of a certain context and need. So that we always have to, this is the way Rory would put it, we always have to ask, what do we expect answering these questions to do for us? Mm-hmm. How, within one historical period, does a question become so significant and so prominent, and then in another historical period, it's completely forgotten? Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it?
What is that?
It's about discontinuity. It's something.
Yeah. So I think Hegel began to convince a lot of later philosophers like Marx or Nietzsche that philosophy had to reconsider the origins of its interests, mm-hmm. and not just assume that these questions are important in themselves, because they're different questions in different ages, mm-hmm. and they have different contexts of use. And pragmatism is like that. We want to know what the answers to these questions will do for us, and is what they'll do for us important?
Yes.
And so a lot of the later, that's certainly true of Heidegger, it's certainly true of Derrida, it's certainly true of Foucault, mm-hmm. it's certainly true of Levinas. So all of these people were convinced of that, but they were also convinced that Hegel had not pursued that question properly, because he tried to, in a way, come up with a system that transcended these parochial, historical, existential contexts. Mm-hmm. So that the first thing you had to do in philosophy was overcome Hegel. Okay. That's sort of what I'm interested in now, the shadow of Hegel over the European tradition on the question of finitude, what philosophy can't do.
Huh. I'm tempted, before all good things come to an end, even this, and before we conclude, I'm wondering if there's anything that comes into your consciousness that you want to say either about Hegel or teaching, or anything we've discussed that you think is important to mention that we've forgotten, or that we've well, it would be kind of banal, but it's very important. I'm quite worried about the fate of books. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
From the viewpoint of academic philosophy, what I do is, apart from all the stuff we've been talking about in aesthetics and in film literature and art history, I'm considered a person who writes commentaries on old books.
That's true.
And that's becoming less and less important within philosophy itself. There's such pressure on. This is true of classicists who work on literary texts from the ancient period and German, French, Italian, Chinese, Japanese specialists in the great books of their tradition.
That's right.
I'm quite concerned, mostly because I think the way in which the books are presented is often so professionally narrow that it isn't clear enough to students why it's absolutely crucial when they have these 4 years of their lives with enormous privilege to just simply to think.
Yes.
Why it's important that their thinking be directed by the people who've thought the greatest thoughts. So my general worry is that the kind of work I do and the books I write and the classes I teach in another generation will be quite rare.
Huh. Now, when you say rare, it'll be seen as now we treat Bataillus if somebody's teaching Bodhi or somebody from that era, something that's or Herodotus.
There would be a very heavy pressure to make everything speak to contemporary social and political concerns, which is important, but it can't be the whole thing. And so I think a more it will be increasingly difficult to find an audience for a course on Henry James, for example.
Do you have a favorite Henry James novel?
The Ambassadors.
The Ambassadors, okay.
Yeah, I think I see James in Strether.
Oh, interesting.
More than in any other character.
You haven't written on the Sacred Fount.
No, I don't. I have one chapter in that book on the short stories, but like you're saying, World Enough in Time, 24/7.
Right, but Sacred Fount is probably his most radical book, don't you think? In many, it's way out.
Yeah. It's almost like a science fiction story. Yeah.
I don't know. Well, I really like what you say about books. So, I think as long as there are people doing what you're doing there in Chicago, I think that it assures that it won't be too rare or so rare.
I hope. I'm sure your podcast will help.
Yes, I do, and I think books. I always have a sense that people say books are back, right? You always see time to time these headlines. Yeah. They might be glib and superficial, but the kids are starting to read again, or there's a renewed interest in books. We'll have to see. I don't know.
Well, we'll have to see. I don't. I have a very privileged position here at the University of Chicago because we get extraordinary students who come here because they want to be challenged by great works of the mind, that kind of thing. Mm. So we have a uniquely intellectual kind of college population, but that hasn't changed. So maybe I'm being overly pessimistic. Mm-hmm. But I think the wealthy private colleges and universities will do fine for the next few generations. It's the state universities, the community colleges, the places where the majority of Americans get educated, not these little bastions of privilege. There is where my worry is.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I share some of that concern. These things are always idiosyncratic, And
they're cyclical. So, it may be a phase. My wife keeps telling me, just relax, it's a phase.
Your wife keeps relax.
Yeah, it's a phase. Don't be so down. Don't be so depressed. It's all coming back. We just have to work through this.
Well, that's what
40 or 50 years.
I got through saying when I saw the headline, books are back,
Yeah.
If books ever left.
I'd take a little more convincing before I believe that. Hard books are not back.
Right.
Late James is not back. Faulkner is not back.
Yeah.
Ezra Pound is not back.
Robert Pippin, I really thank you for your generosity to spend this time on our show.
Of course.
I'm glad you.
I enjoyed our conversation. I'm glad I did it.
And I very much look forward to your Bresson book and future writing.
If you send me your email, I'll put you on the list and make sure you get a copy when it's right off the press.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays to you as well.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.